Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to today's Wednesday lunchtime reflection from St Peter Mancroft Church here in the heart of Norwich. Welcome to the people in the church at the moment and to anyone who might be watching online. I've called today's reflection Beware the Wedge Issue. And I should probably start with an explanation of what that rather trendy term, wedge issue, actually means. So, at its most basic, a wedge issue is a topic on which people's opinions are sharply divided. What do you think of Marmite is a classic example, a question which absolutely divides British opinion. You either love Marmite or you loathe it. End of story. But let's think a little more about the function of a wedge. It's used deliberately to break something apart or to keep a cleft open. You drive a wedge in when you want to create or maintain a gap. And Marmite isn't, of course, a powerful wedge issue. We may disagree about it, but we don't, on the whole, divide ourselves into fiercely opposing factions on the strength of it. A real wedge issue does have that factionalising power. And often, of course, it's tied up with politics. So let's look at an example. And there's been a painfully good example from America in the headlines recently: abortion. Because last week, American women lost their long-held constitutional right to legal abortion following a Supreme Court decision. And anyone who saw the footage of the impassioned demonstrations outside the court following that decision cannot fail to have seen a deep, deep cleft in American society between people who are pro-life against abortion and pro-choice in favour of a woman's control over her own body. And I must say there are, of course, Christians on both sides of this debate. It was Republican judges, now in the majority on the Supreme Court, who pushed through this new ruling on abortion. But the opinion polls actually show that their decision went against the will of the American people, who are allegedly 61% in favour of abortion. And this, I think, creates a political vulnerability for the Republicans at the upcoming midterm elections, because abortion has now become the perfect wedge issue for the Democrats. There's a fair chance that if they talk about it enough, they may be able to divide the Republican Party just a little, yes, drive a little wedge into it and cream off those voters who really care that abortion should remain legal. Behold, wedge politics is born. Now, if you happen to be worried enough about the prospect of Donald Trump winning a second presidential term, this may seem like an entirely desirable outcome to you, and I couldn't possibly comment. But there is also a very undesirable outcome to abortion, or anything else actually, becoming a wedge issue, which is this. Wedge issues work by creating clear blue water, an unbridgeable gap between two opposing points of view. So they work against the process of negotiation and compromise, a way of finding solutions when people are sharply divided. One might almost say that wedge issues work against conciliation, which is, of course, something very close to the Christian heart. Another example, again, very topical, very political, but this time from the UK. In April, our government announced a new policy on immigration to give asylum seekers who've entered this country illegally a one-way ticket to Rwanda. I don't think I need to describe this policy anymore. I'm sure you've heard all about it. And this isn't, on the whole, a policy which divides Christians. Christian leaders of several different denominations have spoken out against it in the strongest possible terms. Now, the first proposed deportation flights to Rwanda scheduled for last week was, of course, cancelled. But far from being a failure, many political commentators are saying that this might actually work in the government's favour. Why on earth should that be? Well, because it was cases handled by liberal-thinking lawyers and then, wait for it, a decision from the European Court of Human Rights which prevented that flight, that deportation flight, from taking place. Note what you've just heard. Europe. Now, the European Court of Human Rights has absolutely nothing to do with the EU. They are part of two completely separate legal systems. But Europe, the word, is of course a most powerful wedge word in this country for obvious reasons. There's a large group of voters who voted Conservative for the first time last election in order to get Brexit done. But that having happened, these voters may now be tempted to return to their Labour roots. But the opinion polls show that these particular voters are largely in favour of the Conservative Rwanda deportation policy. And for these voters in particular, to hear that Europe has interfered is very aggravating indeed. And thus, I've been talking about politics a lot, but there's a really important point here. The treatment of asylum seekers, which should, as our bishops argue, be largely a humanitarian decision, a moral decision, has now become instead a real political hot potato. And yes, we have to face it, a most effective wedge issue, dividing, polarising opinion in this country. And the church, too, has had its fair share of wedge issues over the decades. I wonder if you remember just how divisive the issue of women's ordination was a few years back. This has largely passed, to be replaced by conflict of opinion over same-sex marriage, should the Church of England marry gay couples. The very asking, the posing of this particular question acts tragically, in my opinion, as an effective wedge between the church as an institution and society as a whole, which can't understand why on earth Christians still have such problems with gay relationships. A huge cleft, sadly, is there, making it hard nowadays to talk about Christian faith to young people in particular. I hope I've given enough examples of wedge issues to show just how painful and how damaging their impact can be. So now it's time for a quick thought experiment. Are there any issues which have the power to become wedge issues for you personally? I'm going to name a few hot topics, and as I do, just notice if any of them raise your blood pressure, even just a tiny bit. So here goes. Do any of these act as a red rag to a bull for you personally? What about the impact Brexit is continuing to have on our economy and our society? Should public sector workers go on strike? Rail workers, doctors? Should we build more nuclear power stations to help with the energy crisis? What do you think of vegan sausages? Now, I'm emphatically not saying that we shouldn't have opinions, perhaps passionate opinions on these things. Opinions are necessary for constructive things to happen. But it just isn't constructive when hot topics turn into wedge issues, so that they divide us, so that we can't imagine being friends, for example, with the kind of person who, God forbid, disagrees with us about these things. Someone I know was engaged to be married in 2016. But in the run-up to the Brexit vote, she and her fiancé discovered that they were planning to vote on opposite sides in the referendum. And for a while, that difference of opinion was so acute that it threatened their marriage plans. It was utter agony for both of them. Thank God, in the end, they found their way through it all and are now, I'm glad to say, very happily married. But how tragic it would have been if Brexit had been effective as a wedge issue between these two loving people. I don't want to be estranged from the people around me when we disagree about things, even if they're very important things. But how can I stop this happening? This mechanism seems such an innate part of human nature, doesn't it? Well, here's one technique to try, something which has been picked up very effectively by a couple of radio programmes recently. The technique. You listen as attentively as you possibly can to what your opponents believe and what they feel. You listen, and then you do something more. You put their beliefs and their feelings into your own mouth. Yes, you present out loud in the first person as though they're your opinions. You present out loud the very argument your opponents have been using against you. And you justify their arguments. Wow. It's an extraordinary and a deeply uncomfortable thing to do. But perhaps, just perhaps, it is a way of introducing a wee bit of empathy into that great cleft caused by the wedge issue. And empathy, of course, is what's needed if we're to bring the world together in peace. Thank you so much for joining me today, and peace be with you today. Amen.